he was basing this off was one that was in a particular archive, and it was missing this last bit. So that became the first ever kind of printed version of the Secret Commonwealth, and that version dominated the publication of Secret Commonwealth for the next 150 years. So the very famous one that Alan Lang did in the late 1800s, he basically just revisited Sir Walter Scott's text and then added his own commentary to it. Lang's commentary is actually added as an appendix into the back of this book because it's a really interesting snapshot.
Hello and welcome to the Spirit Box podcast, where we explore folklore, magic, the world of the spirits, and everything in between. Today, I'm joined by Daniel Yates, artist, writer, photographer, witch, and the mind behind the excellent Occult Library project. Daniel's soon-to-be-released book, To Glimpse a Hollow Hill, is the focus of our discussion today. It's a deep and beautifully crafted exploration of Robert Kirk's The Secret Commonwealth, a 17th century manuscript at the heart of Scottish fairy belief and second sight traditions. We talk about the enormous task of transcribing and modernising Kirk's original text, the research into the multiple and fractured versions of the manuscript, the folklore around seers, fairies and fetch spirits, and the complex cultural landscape Kirk was writing from, one caught between Christianity, folk practice and the older ways of seeing the world. One of the most fascinating elements of this conversation is Kirk's description of the Sith, not as the traditional winged fairies of Victorian fantasy, but of a separate people and other, with their own culture, hierarchy and even religious practices. These are beings who lived alongside humans, but by their own rules, sometimes helpful, sometimes dangerous, but always other. Daniel goes into more detail about Kirk himself, not just as a minister and folklorist, but potentially as a seer, working within a Christian framework, which, given the time period, was quite a dangerous path to walk. We discuss the ways in which Kirk subtly inserts himself into the text, the folklore surrounding his mysterious death on Doon Hill, and his possible motivations for writing The Secret Commonwealth, not merely as an academic exercise, but perhaps a defense of the second sight and those who possessed it. In the Plus show, we go deeper into the more esoteric layers of Kirk's Secret Commonwealth and the nature of the Sith. We explore the idea of dual spirits, the concept of co-walkers or fetch spirits that accompany a person or indeed another spirit in harvesting or feeding in some mysterious symbiotic way. Daniel draws intriguing parallels between this belief and spirit traditions found in countries beyond Scotland. We discuss Kirk's accounts of fairy lovers and the complicated, sometimes perilous relationships between humans and the Sith, not framed in the terms of simple good or evil, but as entanglements with otherworldly beings operating by their own strange morality. There's a beautiful reflection here on the porous boundary between worlds and the price of crossing it, where gifts from the other worlds might come with subtle costs, and where seership itself might not be a blessing that's freely given. We also talk about Daniel's work on the Occult Library project, an ambitious and beautifully curated online resource cataloguing the wild and often ephemeral world of occult publishing. Daniel explains how the project came about as a response to the fragmentation of esoteric literature, especially from smaller or long-defunct presses, and his desire to create a browsable, searchable space where people could discover books that otherwise might disappear into obscurity. We discuss the challenges of gathering data on out-of-print and rare texts, the use of volunteers to help expand the library, and Daniel's thoughtful approach to curation. He also shares future plans for the project, including an interactive map of occult locations, possible community features, and ways to sustain the site as it grows. Something that I think we as members of the occult community more broadly should be there to support. Now, if you'd like to hear the Plus show, the simplest thing to do is to follow the link tree below and come and join the Patreon. You'll get the Plus version of this show and 5 years of Plus shows and extra bonus content, including an entirely separate podcast called Nameless, which are conversations between myself and Tommy Kelly. If Patreon isn't your thing, you can always pick up a copy of my book, Song of the Dark Man, Father of Witches, Lord of the Crossroads. To do so, just follow the links below, and that will take you to any of the major bookstores that stock it. Okay, let's get on with the show. Daniel Yates, you are very, very welcome to the Spirit Books. Lovely to have you on the show.
Oh, I'm glad to be here.
Fantastic. Well, it's I don't know, when did we first communicate? A couple of years ago, I think. Peter Mark Adams directed me to your work, and I've been following you for a number of years, and through your various creative endeavors. And you do some really, really interesting, very unique work. And I'm sure we'll get into that today, but we're here to talk about your latest piece of work, latest project, very exciting publication. So to get the show on the road, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your new book?
Well, a bit about myself. No pressure. Wow. I guess I think many people got to know me at first as a photographer. I am what I would call an occult photographer in a sense. My background there was trying to challenge this notion that occult photography and photography of the occult were two different things. And so I was kind of exploring that for a while. And the result of those explorations was a book called Arcanum that was published with Anathema Publishing.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, from there, I think I kind of accidentally fallen into many different arenas because quite often I do something and then people say, "Oh, I like that." I used to do stone carve. Well, I still do stone carving for myself, and I used to make various ritual tools and things. And I was encouraged to share those on Instagram, and then next thing you know, everyone's like, "Can I buy one of these?" I'm like, "Oh, okay." Didn't realize. So then, I think years down the line now, there's many an altar that's probably got some kind of commission of mine that they had done.
Right.
And so I've always been a bit. I want to try. I like to have a try at everything. And so that's the nature of me, is going in many different directions to try many different things, and then seemingly people are interested in that, so that's cool. So I try to kind of throw a whole mixed bag of things on my website for people to look at and see. I've got a fiction book that I wrote just random. I thought, why not? So that's on there. Yeah. And sorry, I'm getting distracted. My new book is To Glimpse a Hollow Hill, which is a revisit, if you would, to Robert Kirk's The Secret Commonwealth, which is a book which is a manuscript rather, that I think has been. It's a super interesting manuscript because I don't want to say it's been overlooked. It's not been overlooked. It's been looked at a lot, but it's just been looked at so many different ways. Sometimes in a mostly complete way, more often than not in an incomplete way. And so it's one of those where it feels like if you wanted to get like a full picture of the Secret Commonwealth, you would really need to buy multiple different texts and things that have looked at it and try and put all of that together. And for many years, I've been kind of doing that very thing just passively for myself. I do this a lot. I kind of, my house is nothing but notebooks everywhere. I cannot go in a shop and not buy a blank notebook. I've got hundreds of them, and they're all full of bits of this and that and the rest of it. And so when I started to kind of like consolidate all of these things, I kind of realized there's a whole book here. And so I started to put all of those things together for myself to try and consolidate like what I kind of knew so far with Secret Commonwealth, and realized with a bit more work, this actually could be something I think other people will be interested in.
Right.
And the book was thus born.
Fantastic. And who are you with? Who's publishing your book?
Atramentus Press.
And when is it actually coming out?
Well, there's 3 different editions of the book. There's a standard edition, what we call the seer edition, and a deluxe edition. So the standard edition got sent off to the printers just a couple of days ago. So that should be in stock and ready to ship in about a month, about 4 weeks.
Oh, sweet.
and then the seer edition, which is kind of like a semi deluxe, and then a full deluxe one. That has to go to the binders at Ludlow. So that'll probably be sometime in the summer, because it takes them months to make. Everything's handmade and all that kind of stuff.
It's going to be one of these beautiful occult books.
Well, me getting carried away and doing lots of different things because I can't help it. I'm forever like making things and tinkering away at things. I decided, it was just going to be the seer edition, which is a particular type in a slipcase, and then the deluxe edition, which is like a full leather parade and in a slipcase. And I'm deciding, well, wouldn't it be nice if each one came with extra things? So I started making things, and then I started making more things, and then I started doing more things. I'm like, oh, word. So the seer edition is coming with like an art card that's like handwritten on and signed and numbered and everything. And then the deluxe edition is coming with the same thing, and then a booklet that I've made, and then a talisman that's kind of almost like a replica of what's suggested in the book. Yeah, I thought that'd be interesting to kind of put in there. But the standard edition should be about 4 weeks, I think, all being well.
Cool. Awesome. So to unpack it a bit, you mentioned that there was lots of different manuscripts, lots of different texts, looking at the Secret Commonwealth and maybe looking at Robert Kirk a bit. So when you're looking through all of these different manuscripts and part of your research, like, were you noticing kind of like a gap in the story, or was it actually putting them all together to give a kind of a larger vista?
There's an entire chapter of the book dedicated to the history of the manuscript, essentially, because it's such a interesting kind of story of how we got from 1691 to today. For example, like for the first like 100 and odd years, that nothing happened to this manuscript at all, and that's simply because he didn't write it to necessarily be published. It was very common back then that people would write these manuscripts to then copy, and it would be distributed amongst their friends. And what would often happen is the friend would hand inscribe, they'd make a copy of it, and then they'd go and take that copy. The first time it was actually published was in the early 1800s by Sir Walter Scott, or commissioned by Sir Walter Scott. But what's interesting is that edition that got published was kind of only 2/3 complete, is only like 2/3 of the manuscript, because the copy of the manuscript that he was basing this off was one that was in a particular archive, and it was missing this last bit. So that became the first ever kind of printed version of the Secret Commonwealth, and that version dominated the publication of Secret Commonwealth for the next 150 years. So the very famous one that Alan Lang did in the late 1800s, he basically just revisited Sir Walter Scott's text and then added his own commentary to it. Lang's commentary is actually added as an appendix into the back of this book, because it's a really interesting snapshot of how people were. This is the thing about Secret Commonwealth, is what you find is that people use the Secret Commonwealth to serve a narrative of the time. So Lang was very much kind of in that what we call the Celtic twilight, where there were all this like resurgence of interest in Celtic tales and fairy stories and everything. And Lang was in the thick of this. Obviously, he's famous for all these fairy books as well. And so he kind of wrote this commentary leaning into that. So I've kind of included that in there because I think it's a really pertinent addition to put in the appendixes. Then there was another edition in the 1930s that basically took... one thing that Alan Lang did do, because he wanted to kind of make it all feel a little ye olde, is he reverted all the S's back to those old long S's.
Oh, okay.
They weren't in the original, not really. There was a couple, but like mostly he just wanted to kind of give it that old flavor, which is okay, sure. However, when we get to this edition in the 1930s, whoever had been tasked with transcribing the document at that time didn't understand what a long S was. So he thought they were Fs, and he couldn't make sense of the text. So he starts to make up words to try and figure out what this sentence is supposed to mean. So he completely butchered it. So the 1930s version is the one, just forget it happened. Just it's a blip in history. But all of these versions were missing apart from the end of the text. And it wasn't until the 60s when, oh wow, his name's gone. I'm so terrible with names, by the way, so I apologize.
I'm there with you. I screw things. My own book, I screw shit up on it all the time. Like,
so there was a version in the 60s that was written for the Folklore Society that actually reproduced the entire document, because obviously Sir Walter Scott had an incomplete document that he was using. A kind of entire document had since been found in the Edinburgh archives, which it was thought is a copy handwritten by one of Robert Kirk's friends at Robert Kirk's house. So it's about, so the original, no, it's long gone. Or no one knows of its existence anywhere. So this is like the oldest copy, and it was from 1692. Look at me muddling my ears up. So it's as close as you're going to get, and it's widely accepted at this point amongst academics that it's the original. His transcribing was good. He kind of messed up a little bit of the Gaelic words and whatnot, but he was getting there. But that was still kind of a slightly obscure academic book, so it was not widely accessible, and it didn't offer any kind of modernization or anything like that. It just like, here's the text. So that is then kind of the de facto copy that you would want to get, but it's not the one that is widely available. Even to this day, the vast majority of versions of the Secret Commonwealth, if you go on Amazon, you can get like a cheap facsimile reprint, but it's still the one that's missing a lot of the chunks from the back. So yeah, there are other editions that are mentioned in the book as well, but there's like a kind of trace a history of these documents and the different kind of attitudes that they've brought to it. There has been a couple more academic approaches in the last kind of, I'd say 10 to 15 years, but I haven't dealt with the more recent ones. I just kind of wanted to show the history of the manuscript and how it's been used over time before then kind of getting into the meat and potatoes of this version. I would like to think that this is as complete as you could be. It provides the Appendix 1 has a transcription of the original text. So if you really want to kind of deep dive the original text, you can. It's there. Then there's the modernization of the text. That was a tricky process to do right, or to do it justice. And then there's an analysis of the history of the manuscript and all the different versions of it. And then there's a couple of you kind of like my commentaries, one where I kind of in the book, you could very much split the Secret Commonwealth into two things. One where he's talking about seers, and one where he's talking about the Sith. There was a whole conversation about Sith and should this be in the title? And I went, no, because far too many people will think Star Wars.
Yeah.
So can we not? Like, it's in the book. So once you bought the book, you're in there. It's fine. But if you put Sith on the cover, it's like someone's expecting like a Darth Maul from the cover or something. I'm like, Revenge of the Sith. So he kind of very much splits it into, there's two arenas he's covering, but he intermingles these in his writing quite extensively. So the modernization presents it as is in a modernized way, but then I've kind of said, right, okay, I want to kind of take all the information about the Sith and let's put it together in a cohesive way so we can then look at it as a singular thing. And I really do think that helps contextualize what he's saying.
Right.
And very much so with the seers as well. And in the work that was done looking at when he's writing about the seers, I discovered, for example, there's a mistake in the transcription that Lang did that has subsequently persisted through all those other transcriptions. And what it does is actually give from a practitioner point of view, it actually gives a distinct error in method. So there's a description on how a seer can actually allow somebody else to see what they see. And there's this kind of ritualized process. And Lang got one of the kind of instructions for this back to front. So he's actually telling it you're wrong. So I've corrected that and pointed it out. So this is actually, there is a few, because when you put this information together, rather than having it all dotted around in Kirk's writing, the common denominator start to surface, and you start to see the patterns of behavior and the patterns of Sith behavior and seer behavior. And you're like, this makes more sense now, because I'm seeing this consistency in what's going on, which is hard to follow that consistency when Kirk bounces around a lot of talking about this and that, and then this and then that, and then this and then that. And then, of course, many have had to try and do this whilst dealing with Kirk's language of the time, which is elusive, because you can read it and, like, I would say like 90 to 95% of the words are familiar words.
Yeah.
But they don't necessarily mean the same thing. So that's when it becomes a real, people can very easily misread and misunderstand what they're saying, what's being said. So that was kind of the argument for modernization as well, was to
that makes that makes an awful lot of sense, particularly the language point. Like, I see it quite a lot in looking at the kind of the Irish manuscripts and certain terms that are used, and when you look at kind of some the Gaelic version of it, it imparts a very different meaning. Like the descriptions of things, and like it ended up kind of pushing me towards like relearning Irish. From my school days. In terms of like some of the words, because I think those the Amazon crappy versions that you mentioned. I have one upstairs. I'm guilty of that.
We've all got one, because to be honest, that's mostly what's available. Like, even the most recent kind of more, like I say, in the last kind of 10 years, versions that have come about, and now much harder to get hold of and silly prices when you do find them.
And how did you get into the language? Was it just a process of study, or like did you find yourself like almost started to try and think in that language to understand it more?
I kind of said jokingly in the midst of all this work, but it wasn't a joke. It kind of panned out that way. I was saying to the wife, I don't think I'm ever going to write correct English again, because when I'm transcribing, all the spellings are like, even just doing, getting the transcription in a digital format, which that, basically had to write out the whole thing. It took a long while. Now, the funny thing is that a lot of these spellings actually make far more sense. You realize that as English has developed over the centuries, we've added so many unnecessary letters. And so it was kind of refreshing to see how much more simple and actually straightforward this language was. But some of the words, you have to just be. I've got my cheat sheet here. I thought I'll give a couple of examples. So, like, when dealing with how ambiguous his kind of lexicon was, right? There's a healing charm in the book, for example, where he uses the word addle. And in anyone that would read that is to addle is to be confused. I'm addled, but addled means rotten egg.
Oh, okay, right.
An ingredient.
Wow.
So, that's just one of an endless list of examples where the word does just not mean the same thing anymore. So you really have to tread very, very carefully with how you're looking at it. And this is when a simple transcribing and shifting to a modernization, that process took a long time, because there's no quick way of doing this. You've just got to really slug through and break down what is actually being said. But like, again, like I said, I've got my cheat sheet here for studying the language. There's so many examples of where you have to be super, super careful. A particular one is where are we? Dealing with anachronisms. So, for example, one of the descriptions that he gives for the Sith is it says that they have light changeable bodies, somewhat like a condensed cloud. And so he's very keen on, he spends a lot of time telling you about the kind of physical characteristic of this, and that it is like a condensed cloud. Now, what I've seen others do, which I think is doing a disservice to it, is to, instead referring to it this way, instead saying they have astral bodies. And it's like, no, that's not what he's saying. He's not saying, because astral body, I think especially for the kind of the occult community, is a very loaded word. It has many meanings, but I think we can all kind of agree it means a little bit of the other, of this other process or this other state. And Kirk is not saying that. He's like, these are very much physically present. This is not some journey into another world. Like, I mean, we can get into that about other worlds and stuff, because this is not what Kirk is saying. He's not saying these other realms where they kind of hide out. He's like, it's very much here. It's another space of here as opposed to some other place somewhere else.
Right.
And they are very much here as opposed to being this othered, spectral, ghostly, in another realm kind of beings. He's just simply not saying that at all. It's not there. And this is what, and please tell me if I digress.
No, I'm taking a note. So, yeah.
This is what led, like, a big part of me to want to kind of study this work, is because I feel that the Secret Commonwealth has been incorrectly used to justify certain points of view in regards to what fairy is, interaction with fairy, various different kind of component parts of their reality, even things like iron, has been, I think, misrepresented or misunderstood. And often people are using Secret Commonwealth as because it says so in Secret Commonwealth.
Yeah.
And so, To Glimpse a Hollow Hill is kind of saying, no, actually, I think if you actually read it properly, you'll find that's not the case. Like, the most common thing I hear, I think the most common thing, pretty much anybody, if you ask them like about fairy, you inadvertently will always end up talking about iron, and about how it repels them, it repulses them. They're kind of. This is very much, in the grand scheme of things, a modern development. And when I say modern, in kind of like the last 200 years or so, really, the further back you go, the less of a thing this actually becomes, to the point where you get instances in other traditions. Where like the queen of Elfham or the queen of fairy can be referred to as wearing an iron crown. It's like, that doesn't really sound like something that's allergic or repulsed by. Now, I think what has actually happened, my kind of working theory with this, and I don't get into it too much in the book, I kind of talk about it briefly because I don't want to put too much of my working theories into the book. I'd rather just present a look at Kirk's work directly. But I do briefly mention it, that historically the whole thing with iron is very much more related to do with things like ghosts, things that are very actually what was seen as otherworldly or not necessarily here, and the iron repels them. And the issue is that what's happened, and this was never originally the case, fairy was always originally seen as very much present here, part of our reality, not some other thing. But then as time has gone by, especially post Kirk, so as we get into the 1800s, especially the back end of the 1800s with the Celtic revival and the Celtic, as they call the Celtic Twilight, they very much leaned into fairy as being other. And so by proxy of this, iron applies to the other, so iron applies to fairies.
Right.
But there's not really an historical precedent for it. Most mythologies, most folklore is, it talks about when you look at the folklore surrounding mines and the fairies around metal and leading people to metal and so on, and they're present around it all the time. It doesn't really support this notion that they're repelled by it. And I think my working theory is that that's what's happened, is that the two worlds of like kind of the spectral, ghostly has been intermingled. The fairies have been intermingled with these, lumped together with them, I think, and that doesn't really do them justice because I don't think that's the case. And Kirk argues extensively through the book, this is not the case. They are not these. They are not the same. They're not related. He says they're not related to witches. They're not related to werewolves. They're not related to ghosts. They are this. He's very kind of keen to be clear on what he thinks they are. So, yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah, I remember like seeing it when I did that jinn work in India, that iron was seen to repel the jinn. That was certainly used by like Sufis to test if people had jinn problems, possession, that kind of thing. So yeah, but I get what you're saying about the kind of a spectral world versus something that is here. You know, that makes sense.
Kind of a spectral, astral type of thing. I mean, it could even be argued from that. Then you could explore the notion further that could you use iron then as a litmus test as where in this kind of cosmology of things does this particular entity sit? Yeah. You could perhaps help gauge where that sits, like jinn compared to say the Sith, by the responses to various things.
So. You've spoken a bit about Robert Kirk. Could you do a bit of a dive into him?
Oh yeah, I love him. I would love. Seriously, he's one of these at this point. You know, when you have that, who would you invite to dinner, whether alive or dead? Robert Kirk would be packed right there with a good number of others. I would love to just pick his brains.
Yeah.
I have a working theory on Kirk too, and I did avoid kind of getting into it in the book because again I didn't want to promote just my own theories too much as opposed to just presenting the information. I'm almost certain that Kirk was a seer. I know he was a Christian minister, but I'm almost positive that he was a seer. And I feel like the entire work of the Secret Commonwealth was him, because you have to really understand when Secret Commonwealth was written. The witch trials were in full effect in Scotland, and he's saying what he's saying in the midst of all this. And I was kind of like often sat here working on things and looking at the message and saying, the absolute taters on this fella is unbelievable, because to do this in the midst of all of that was a really dangerous thing to do. He could have absolutely been strung up. He absolutely could have been strung up, but it kind of explains his approach. So we'll get into his approach in a minute, but I think he's very much, this feels like a kind of manuscript in defense of seers, and he's using other seers in proxy of himself.
Right.
When you look at his life, he's often described as, like his death is always the fascinating story, which is Doonhill, just behind where he lived. And he was last seen in his nightgown walking up Doonhill, and the next thing you know, he's dead. And it's thought, well, he wasn't dead. It's thought that his grave is empty and full of stones, and that he was taken into the world of the Sith, like into the Hollow Hills. And then he has this, and a kind of almost like an apparition of him, a vision of him appears to, I think it's his cousin, who, and he tells him the criteria of how you can free me from this place. He said, like, when somebody's christening, he's going to show up and you need to pull out your dagger and throw it at me. And if you don't hesitate and you throw this dagger at me, I can come back as in some kind of somehow sever this connection. Again, a lot of assumption was made it was an iron dagger. So people used that to play into this notion of iron. There's nothing that says it's an iron dagger. It's just a dagger. The chances of it being an iron dagger are pretty slim. So it's the whole thing of like severing some kind of connection and I can come back. Now, when this apparently happens and there's an entire church full of people going, bloody hell, this guy's here. And they hesitate. And because he hesitates, he's gone. And so then it's like it's assumed to know he's in the Hollow Hills indefinitely. And to this day, there's a pine tree on top of Doonhill, and everyone's tying clooties to it and everything. It's kind of become very much a shrine to it.
Right.
I recommend everybody do a pilgrimage there at least once. Because if you don't get the vibe, and I think people will know what I mean when I say this, if you don't get the vibe when you go there, I'll eat my hat. The place is humming. It's
Right.
absolutely humming. Now, I'm a theologian, so I could debate the characteristics of this till I'm blue in the face. Is it humming because of the place, or is it humming because of what people are putting into the place?
Mhm.
I'd say both, actually, at this point. I think that's
Right.
why it's so woo. But I very much think he's a seer. He's often describing things. I think there's a couple of instances where he kind of slips up and it's almost like it's becoming self-referential. It's like he's talking about himself whilst he was supposed to be talking about somebody else.
Right.
And he was very sympathetic to this practice and very much kind of speaking in defense of it, and how and sometimes he places victims as seers, as victims. So he's saying they didn't choose to be this. So he distinguishes seers clearly from the likes of witches. Whereas to be a witch, he's saying, is elective. You're choosing to take that path.
Mhm.
A seer is just something that has it foisted on them. And he gives examples where a child is a seer and they grow up and it's gone, or someone's going to have their life and nothing, and then all of a sudden this thing happens to them. And so it's not by choice. And if it's not by choice, this must be something that is within God's remit. And then he absolutely lays the biblical references on thick to support instances of seership, instances of people having this ability and it not being demonically inspired. He even goes as far as to try and cosmologically situate the Sith in a place that's not hell,
Right.
that they're in an in-between place because of the nature of their physicality. I mean, it even goes on to he kind of dives into the first law of thermodynamics and about how because he was a minister, but he was very much a man of his time, interested in the emerging sciences, and he refers to it quite a bit to explain, it's trying to look at their vaporous nature and what that might mean, and what that could be. And so, again, with the modernization, you have to be careful about understanding the science of the time and being careful to not project kind of occult terminology onto what he's trying to explain as science. So to kind of be faithful to what he's trying to say. And I did find many an instance where my brain's going, oh, this is that, like from an occult perspective.
Right.
But then going, no. Like as much as I might want to say, to the point where I almost felt like, you know what, I feel like I need to write a little companion mini book.
Yeah, I was just about to say, is there going to be a
my
companion?
Well, I think what I might do, I've thought about it, is kind of do a little blog series of thoughts beyond the Hollow Hill, kind of like, just my personal thoughts from an occultist's perspective on how I look at some of what he's saying, which I think will be interesting, and there could be discussion around that then. But I was really keen to not talk over Robert. I really wanted his voice to come through in the book as much as possible.
Fabulous. I had no idea that he was really putting it out there, like in defense of seers so much. That's really intriguing, and you're absolutely right about the time. It would been extraordinarily dangerous to do so. But it's so kind of ahead of its time as well. I mean, I look back at like a lot of them are kind of like modern translations of the old kind of Gaelic texts around the Fenian cycle, and they originally were transcribed by monks, by Celtic monks, and they talk about the story of Oisin when he comes back from Tirnanog, right? And he's told not to touch the ground. That's the taboo. And he touches the ground, and he immediately ages several centuries in the time, the Earth time that he's been away in Tirnanog. And he eventually is taken to St. Patrick, where they have this series of it's called the arguments, right? The kind of theological age of heroes versus the Christianity as presented by the monks and played out through Patrick. First off, it's astounding that you have a half fairy being from the stories in Oisin, debating with the patron saint. But it gives an idea of like the monks were kind of able to hold those two worlds to a degree, and write to them. But one specific point they make, and Patrick says to Oisin that the Fianna, including Finn McCool, are all in hell because they have not accepted Christ. And Oisin was thoroughly offended by this because these were, the heroes, of great stature who did great deeds, but they were still placed in hell, and that was like, even though it's older than Kirk's work originally, like Celtic Christianity wasn't Roman Christianity, as you know well. No, like it was a little bit lighter, but they still put these heroes in hell. So for Kirk to come out and kind of go in a real place, like with the real seers who were existing and kind of in a, I guess, an oblique defense of them, is extraordinary.
Like Kirk was very heavily, what he's outside of Secret Commonwealth, what he's actually the most famous for is writing something. Was it called the Gaelic Psalter, I think, or the Celtic Psalter or something, where he worked extensively on translating these English Christian texts into Gaelic.
Oh wow!
And that was his big main thing. And so he was very, very much in that community. In that, but interestingly, I think that's the thing. He was in that community as opposed to surrounding that community,
right?
And so because he's in it, he's extremely sympathetic to it. He understands the nuances of the people's culture because it's his culture. It's not, you got the likes of Patrick. It's like, well, he's very much an incumbent. He's coming in and approaching this where he's not Irish, And so, but Kirk is very much a Scotsman through and through. And he's of his people, and he's not dismissive of his people.
Yeah.
A good example of this actually is something. So I mentioned earlier that the many of the editions of the book are missing parts. The part where it kind of gets cut off is the book is split into, I think, 4 distinct parts. So you've got the Secret Commonwealth proper, which is kind of his essay. Then it's followed by a letter to Lord Talbot, and then it's followed by a a treatise of Scottish-Irish charms and spells, and then it's followed by this kind of lexicon to explain what many of the words mean throughout the book, especially ones that would have been considered scientific and fringe at the time, and a lot of people wouldn't have understood. We read them and think, why is that? I know what that means. We take it for granted that we know what these words mean. Now, interestingly, a lot of these editions that are missing sections kind of cut the letter to Lord Talbot off partway through. That's where a lot of those other ones stop. So the letter to Lord Talbot is interesting because it's not a letter that Kirk wrote to Lord Talbot. It was a letter written by Lord Talbot to insert name here, subtitles or something, because I'm bloody awful with names. He's writing to a friend of his and saying, giving all his observations of, I've traveled around Scotland and I've seen all these, like, I've heard about these seers and I've seen them do this and I've seen them do that and I've seen them do this, all kind of evidence of like, wow, I saw all this stuff. But then at the end of the letter, he's kind of dismissing it all away as country bumpkin silliness of like, but, at the end of the day, these people don't really know what they, it's very much Lord Talbot. It's like, hey, these don't know what they're doing, and so on and so on and so on. So this letter was from Talbot to this dude. And then it seems like Kirk managed to have a copy of this letter. And what he's done is he's kind of put the letter in, and then he's added on to the end of the letter, say, my dear Lord Talbot, is that, but I don't, to the best of my knowledge and research, this was never sent to Lord Talbot, and I have a suspicion it was never really meant to. He was just using this letter as a point of proof.
Right.
And then saying, but in regards to your dismissing of all of this, let me just kind of, and then he starts to really rally the defense. This is where he doubles down heavily on the defense of seers and uses endless biblical quotes to back up his defenses of seers. That, seers are very much kind of biblically ordained as a real thing and not bad at this point, as far as he's concerned. And then he kind of does a bit of a Q&A And it's during the Q&A that most of these previous editions were cut off, and it's kind of a shame because that's when it's getting interesting. But that's now been restored, so it's all in there. So the whole Q&A and the whole statements that he makes are all in there. And yeah, he's... but I don't think he ever was intending on sending this to Lord Talbot. I think he just used it as like a template on which to base a defense. It's a very curious, like, it's not kind of a the whole document of what we call the Secret Commonwealth is not really a cohesive whole. It's an essay, a letter with his response to it, a little collection of charms and spells he's picked up along the way, and then a lexicon to explain things. I have to wonder if he hadn't died, if this wouldn't have been worked on further and further, and then eventually become a whole thing. But unfortunately, we'll never know. But as it is, it was very much the missing parts. Like, some could argue, well, at the end of the day, do we really need the lexicon? Well, the completionist in me says absolutely, and so is there. This is what's in the book. I hope and pray is as complete as it can be, as it's ever going to be. So hopefully people don't need to then go try and find a million different editions of things. You never know.
One bit that fascinates me from the Secret Commonwealth, and I think I referenced this in my book, was around the reference of the kind of the fairies, the kind of sexual interest in the Highlanders, the young Highlanders. There's an account of a Highlander waking up being kind of I think sexually approached, and was that it? No, he young Highlander woke up and was like swinging his sword around in fright at being attacked or accosted in some way. But it also talks about whatever the equivalent of like a Lana She, like a fairy lover.
Yeah,
there's the reference to that.
Well, yeah, it's. I think I'm not. No, I'm always very cautious with Scots Gaelic because I butcher the hell out of it. It was something like Lan and Sith of the same thing. These kind of these succubi type. I'm always a bit wary of using the word succubus because, again, especially in the cult field, it's a very loaded word. These were not particularly. There's a lot about the Sith that I think Kirk mentions. He's keen to say they're not evil. They're not necessarily bad. In fact, I think I've got on my notes here for the modernization. Yeah. So one of the things I had to focus on is respecting the ambiguity of what he's saying. So an example of this, sometimes he's particularly vague or speculative with something. And an example is where he says, they do not commit all the harm they appear capable of. Which hints at moral complexity. So, for example, to preserve, the challenge here is to preserve that ambiguity rather than rephrasing it into something like they're mostly harmless, which is not what he's saying. He's kind of saying they can be, but they generally don't, which is harmless. It kind of suggests not actually even capable of. They're harmless. You don't have to. It's like, no, they're not harmless. They are more than capable, but they don't do it. And that is often the case. There's many an instance where he talks about them not being, particularly, there's no particular vitriol towards us. One thing that does get repeated is as long as engagement or vision of them is consensual. So if you kind of espy upon them in some kind of manner, and they are not aware of it, or they didn't kind of allow it initially, that's when they seem to kick off. And so when it talks about in the book about here's a manner in which a seer can allow somebody else to see them, it also says, but brace yourself and strap in, because the first thing they're going to do when they see that you're looking is they're going to come rushing at you. They hate that. So they're very much fine with things. it's circumstantial. It's that the circumstances dictate what's going on. So there's not, there's this, it's easy to fall into this binary thinking, are they good or are they bad? And it's like, well, they're not. They are a species. They're a thing that you can have an encounter with them. It's totally fine. However, during the seasonal shifts, they're a kind of semi-nomadic. So he describes them as a semi-nomadic people. During certain seasonal shifts is when they move from one place to another, and they will literally pack their bags. They have all their things, and they move like a tribe. And when they do this, they're dangerous because they would be. It would make sense. They're exposed. They have children, they have like family units, so they have this sense of things to protect, and so when they are exposed and on the move, they are a threat. So like it's like seers are like it's joked about that this is the only time you're going to find the seers in the church is like on Ember Days, because they go to church because they don't want to be out there and run the risk of encountering them when this seasonal shift day is happening, because it's super, super dangerous. They are, like a raw nerve, don't go there. But then the next day you'll find the churches are empty because nobody wants to. It's all fine now, don't you? You've got church now, it's fine. So they go and kind of go sit there because it's like, we're okay in here, it's all right. And so the Lannan Sith is they're kind of the same thing. It's the thing is, though, that encounters with them often result in the person being very kind of drained or getting ill. And it's like, but you have to then look at this with an open mind. Is this being done to them? It's not suggested that it is. It's just that this is a price of encounter. This is what happens to you. Now he does go into details about how they eat. That their vaporous nature means that they absorb the essence of things. They don't physically chomp down on food. They're absorbing the spiritus essence of something. And so I would imagine to be around one for any period of time, that process is going to potentially happen. That's going to make you unwell. Mm-hmm. If you are really doubling down and having sexual encounters with one, well, what kind of effect is that going to have on a person? But you have to be careful and say, so is this just a result of encounter? Mm-hmm. Or is this actually an intended harming of the human? The evidence suggests the former. It doesn't suggest that this is intentional, but it's also suggested that they're capable, but they generally don't. So I think they've been misunderstood and misrepresented through the years, partly and largely due to misreadings of Secret Commonwealth, because people have only had access to that older language and not necessarily got the nuance of what he's saying.
Daniel, it's been a pleasure chatting to you. I've really, really enjoyed. I guess that almost 2 hours of whiz by here. But it's been brilliant. It's so illuminating. I'm really looking forward to the book. I'm going to order a copy. That your the detail and insight that you've spoken about today has just really kind of whet my appetite. I want more. So thank you so much for coming on the Spirit Box. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
For anybody who would want to find more about you, where to get the book, and where to find the Occult Library project, where's the best way to do so?
Well, more about me is my personal website, which is photophrenic.com. You can see my artwork and objects and things that all sorts of things. It's a whole mishmash of all sorts. The Occult Library is occultlibrary.org. We have a mailing list. I always recommend people sign up for that. There's at least one email, sometimes 2 a month, that go out with just updates on what's been added to the site, what's forthcoming, things like that. And then for the book, if you want to buy that, you can go to atramentuspress.com, and you can buy the book direct from Atramentus Press. And I do believe, so usually stateside, if people are stateside, some bookstores like potentially Miskatonic, Rosarian Blend, sometimes I think stock Atramentus books. So you can always get in touch with them if you want to try and get one kind of that side of the pond. If they don't, you can always request it. You never know. But failing that, you can get it direct from atramentuspress.com.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for coming on Spirit Box.
Oh, Doc, I'm glad to come.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I really enjoyed that chat. That was superb. There's so many wonderful, wonderful texts coming out at the moment, and this is at the top of my list. I really enjoyed what I've experienced so far about this publication, and I look forward to delving in further when my copy arrives. So I'm going to leave it there, and we'll catch up soon. Take care and talk soon. I'm Darren Mason, and you've been listening to the Spirit Box. Bye.